A Game of Solitaire, written by C. Scott Marcano. Chapter 4. A Heart Like a Steel Drum. I sat for a long time at my desk, staring at my phone, debating whether to make the call. It was around 11 o'clock the morning after I found the secret letter from my mother hidden inside the puzzle box. I tried to go back to sleep briefly after reading it, but I gave up on the idea quickly. My mind was racing, and my gut too saturated with raw emotions. I drank some coffee, then reread the startling correspondence a few more times before finally tucking it away in my desk drawer where I kept my most personal and important items. My phone screen was open to Jeff Crook's number. Several times my finger had hovered over the call button, only to be pulled back. I couldn't quite bring myself to press it. I knew if I went through with the call, there was no turning back. Jeff would certainly give me an entry-level job at his entertainment company if I begged him hard enough, but doing so would mean ending my so-called investigation into my mother's death. If I took the job, I would have to move on. I was ready to do just that before I read the letter. Now, though, apart from the disturbing revelation that my grandfather tried to stop my parents' interracial marriage with a bullet, what did my mom mean when she wrote that there was more to the story involving my grandmother? There were so many unanswered questions that were almost impossible to walk away from, not to mention the eerie way I found the letter. I'm not a big believer in the supernatural, but why had the box fallen down like that? Was it just coincidence, or was someone trying to get my attention? Just then, the opening chorus to Sheena is a Punk Rocker suddenly blasted out of my phone. The Ramones song was my ringtone. I wasn't in the mood to talk to anyone right now, but I checked the number anyway. The caller ID said it was an international call from France. What the hell? I said to myself. I didn't know anyone in France. Then I realized it was probably my dad. He and my stepmother Ruth were on vacation, taking a bicycle tour through Europe. They were probably just calling to say hello and tell me about their trip. "What's up, Pops?" I said, trying not to let on how upset I was. The male voice that responded to me was unfamiliar, though, however. Hello. Is this Des?" he asked, cautiously, in a heavy French accent. It was a young man who sounded like he was in his 20s. "Yeah, who's this?" "This is Luke." "I don't know anyone named Luke. What do you want?" I demanded. "Please, don't hang up. Your father gave me your number. I know is a little strange, perhaps, calling you out of the blue, but I am still Beth's son, your cousin." Holy fuck, I said to myself. I almost dropped the phone. I was so shocked. I did know Luke, or at least I'd heard of him. I'd followed the details of his chaotic life for years, but I'd never imagined I'd ever actually spoke to him. "Luke, wow, how are you?" "I am fine. I'm sorry. Is this a bad time? You are busy?" "No, not at all." "Oh, good," Luke said. "I'm very happy for that. I wanted to call you for a long time now, but, well, it just wasn't possible. Claudette, my grandmother, she does not approve of me speaking to my Trinidadian relations. It's a long story, as you may know. But I had lunch with your father and your stepmother yesterday. They came by my mother's apartment in Paris, and I met them there. It was so nice. We had a lovely talk. It inspired me to ask for your number. To give you honesty, I was most nervous to call, but finally I said, fuck it. Luke, just do it, like Nike. We both let out a laugh. "That's totally cool, man. Forgive me. I'm just kind of blown away that I'm actually talking to you. I've heard so much about you." "Yes, very much the same here, cuz." The saga of Luke was a legend on my father's side of the family. Even outside of the family, his story was well known and gossiped about as it had formed the basis of an ugly international incident between Trinidad and Tobago and France. I'd first become aware of Luke's existence when I was about 11 years old. I had noticed a small frame photograph of a young boy sitting on the shelf in my father's study. I thought it was a picture of my brother at first because the family resemblance was so striking. The boy looked to be about 7 years old, wearing a trim, European-styled turtleneck sweater. He was standing alone in a pretty garden somewhere, but he was looking straight ahead into the camera with a sad expression on his lonely face. "Who's that, Dad?" I asked. My father looked up from a Dodger game he was watching. His expression suddenly became grim. "Oh, that's your cousin, Luke. He's your Aunt Steelbeth's son. Dad gestured to the picture next to it that I knew quite well. It was the only picture he had ever displayed in the house of his siblings. I had never met any of my relatives in the photo, but it had always intrigued me. In the picture, my father was wearing a nice suit with a white carnation tucked into his lapel. Standing beside him were his 7 sisters, dressed beautifully as bridesmaids. Simone, Connie, Disha, Aliyah, Marie, Annie, and the youngest of the Marinos, the bride, Steelbeth. Steely was named in honor of the steel drum, the iconic national instrument of Trinidad. She was wearing a beautiful wedding dress, but instead of a tiara or veil, she wore a fashionable, broad-brimmed hat upon her pretty head. She looked like a model out of Vogue. She was grinning ear to ear with a $1 million smile. The photo had been taken at her wedding to her ex-husband Marcel, who wasn't pictured. In the background behind them was a huge chateau that had been in Marcel's family for generations. "Luke, huh? I'd like to meet him one day," I blurted out. "Is he in Trinidad?" My father paused, then let out a sigh. "No. He's with his father in France. Unfortunately, you probably won't ever get to meet him." "Why not?" I asked. "It's complicated," my father said before going back to watching his game. I knew better than to keep probing him. When it came to talking about his side of the family, Dad was mysterious and silent as a Moai statue on Easter Island. Over my teenage years, however, little pieces of information trickled out of him, and occasionally my mother, which filled in the portrait of my Trinidadian roots like a half-finished jigsaw puzzle. Over time, I learned that my dad's estrangement from his family was due to the deep pain inflicted on everyone by my grandfather, Peter Charles Marino, a.k.a. the Jaguar. Jags got his nickname because, by all accounts, he was an aggressive character who'd literally rip you to pieces with his bare hands if you crossed him. He was a customs official in the port of Spain who worked himself to the bone to support his large family. According to my mother, Jags was a devout Catholic who ruled his home with an iron fist. To his credit, his domineering nature kept his children out of trouble. They were all excellent students in school, but his temperament was volatile. He beat my grandmother, Consi, and his children when they displeased him. He also held a particularly strong grudge against white people, particularly the British, whom he held in utter contempt for discriminating against the people of Trinidad during their long colonial rule over the island. Sadly, just like my mother's white parents, Dad's family had stopped speaking to him because Jags didn't approve of his interracial marriage. Jags even went so far as to insist that the rest of the family follow suit, which had created a painful rift between Dad and his siblings that never fully healed, even after Jags passed away when I was in high school. "Do you skateboard by any chance?" Luke asked me. "Yes," I replied enthusiastically, "but I don't shred like I used to, actually. I kind of suck now," Luke laughed. "I suck too, but it's just for fun, no? When I come to California, we should skate together." "That'd be freaking cool," I said. After talking for an hour or so, Luke finally bid me adieu. We agreed to speak again soon. After I hung up, I felt exhilarated, not because I had finally spoken to him, because it meant that things had gotten better for him. He was reconnecting with us, the family he had been told so many lies about. And the thrill of speaking after the thrill of speaking to Luke finally passed, my attention turned back to my phone and my decision regarding Jeff Crook. After a few moments of deep contemplation, I put the phone away. I had to see this thing through to the bitter end. I'd come this far. I needed to know the truth, just like Luke. "Do you know what the word veracity means?" asked Joe Pesci as he took a long drag off his cigarette. Joe was an overweight, swami-looking man who sweated profusely and chain-smoked Lucky Strikes. He was a licensed PI who had his own detective agency on Skid Row, near Billy Rose's place. Although Billy hated Pesci's guts, he kept it on the down low because the two had worked with the same lawyers, and as a result, sometimes had to suffer through an arranged marriage, splitting a case together. It was close to midnight. The three of us had parked our cars discreetly on the side of an unpaved fire road on a hilltop overlooking East Pasadena. The vantage point gave us an excellent, unobstructed view of a quiet suburban neighborhood that stretched below us. We were quietly staking out the home of 33-year-old Amanda Torres. Ms. Torres was a recent divorcee from our client, Sam Avagnian, one of the biggest real estate developers in LA. Our case was part of an ugly custody battle between them over their 4-year-old son, Jake. Simply put, our job was to dig up dirt on Amanda so the judge would revoke her hard-fought custody and grant Mr. Avagnian's full parental rights over Jake. To that end, we were spying on Amanda, hoping we'd catch her doing something unmotherly that her ex could use against her. Veracity, I replied. It means truthfulness. Joe looked surprised, like he never expected someone of my skin hue to know the definition. Not quite, he sputtered. Actually, it means level of truthfulness, to be precise. Right, Billy Rose chimed in as he scanned the craftsman-style home with his binoculars. It's all about establishing this woman's veracity. Exactly, Joe continued. We need to prove this bitch has zero credibility, you know what I mean? Honestly, I thought this case would be a fucking cakewalk, but this gold-digging bitch is a little smarter than I give her credit for. I don't think we're going to catch her doing shit spying on her like this. So, me and Billy were thinking that we might need to prime the pump a little. For the good of the child, Billy added. That's right, for the good of the fucking kid. See, this chick is a bad mother. She's an AA because she's a drunk. She swore to the kid that she's been sober since the kid was born. But I'd bet my house the bitch is still boozing it up on the sly. If we could just get a pic of her having a shot of tequila at a bar or something, it would prove to the court what a lying-ass cunt she really is. That's where you come in, Des. You're a good-looking guy. Latino. You're probably her type. What if you casually ran into her somewhere? Like Starbucks, Billy offered. That's perfect. You could start a conversation, lay on the charm, and get her to go on a date with you. You take her out to a bar or a restaurant, order some drinks, then snap a pic when she's not looking. Bam! Case closed. What you think? I thought about it for half a nanosecond. I'll pass. Not my thing. You sure, Joe said? Not even for little Jakey? I'm telling you, the kid needs someone to step up and be a hero right now. Tell you what, I'll even throw in a $1,000 bonus if you make it happen. Sorry, Joe, I said firmly. I'm just no good at seduction. Joe stared at me, looking a little pissed. 2 G's? I shook my head. Joe threw down his butt and angrily stomped it out in the dirt. He turned to Billy. I'm out of here, man. You coming? Billy nodded and handed me his binoculars. Asshole, I muttered as I watched the taillights of Joe's car fade away into the night. His request had touched a particular raw nerve with me. I'd been thinking about my cousin Luke and what he and my aunt Steelbeth had gone through all day. I was in college by the time I heard the whole story. By then, my father's parents had passed away, and without the Jaguar around, Dad's relationship with his siblings began to slowly improve. The thaw was helped along considerably by my brilliant and affable cousin, Ronnie, who showed up unexpectedly on my father's doorstep one day, wanting to meet the mysterious uncle in California he'd heard about. Ronnie was my Aunt Annie's son. He had just graduated from Penn State University and was moving to San Francisco. Ronnie and Dad immediately hit it off, which isn't surprising, as Ronnie is such an incredibly outgoing, engaging person that it's literally impossible for anyone not to like him. One day, bored on a summer break during my sophomore year of college, I wandered into my father's study, hoping to find a book to read. I was perusing his bookshelf when I happened upon the old framed photo of Luke. I paused for a moment and stared at it curiously. My father, who was working at his desk, glanced over at me. I should have told you more, he suddenly said. About Luke? I asked with surprise. About everything. My father looked off for a moment, pondering something. Then he turned back to me. You want to know the story about your cousin? Yes, I would. You should pull up a chair then. It's a long story. Luke's saga began when my Aunt Steelbeth left Trinidad to spend a summer on the nearby Isle of Martinique. She was young and beautiful then, and always ripe for adventure and mischief. Indeed, Steely was gorgeous in her youth, and was much sought after by an army of would-be suitors, but to the chagrin of many a broken heart, Steelbeth would have none of the men in Port of Spain. As they used to say, her beauty was her curse because it made her picky, or as my Auntie Annie put it so vividly, too many choices are bad things sometimes, you know. Like when you go shopping in the market and the seller offer you 50 good mangoes and they all look so ripe and juicy that you just can't decide. That's what happened to poor Steely. The girl just couldn't decide which man to pick. So finally she took the one that looked the best on the outside, but on the inside he was rotten. It was on Martinique that Steelbeth fell head over heels in love with Marcel. They met at his high-end salon where Marcel worked as a hairdresser. Like Steelbeth, he had many suitors because he was young, handsome, and more importantly, fabulously wealthy. Marcel had come from old money back in France, very old money. As I mentioned before, his family owned a centuries-old chateau near Paris, although it did seem rather curious to many that the scion of an aristocratic French family was slumming it on a small Caribbean island. Steely didn't question it. "Marcel's not interested in money. His family's too controlling," Steely explained to her sisters. "He just wants to be free and happy," to which her fiercely loyal but level-headed sister, Aliyah, replied, "No man gives up a fortune just to be happy. If he tells you so, he's either lying or drunk." But Steely didn't care what Aliyah had to say. She was in love. Marcel and Steely married after a couple of months of torrid dating. They returned to Port of Spain, where Marcel opened up a new hair salon. Shortly afterwards, Steely gave birth to Luc. For a few years, the marriage seemed to be going well. The only trouble seemed to be the unusually strong attachment Steely had with Luc. She fretted over him constantly and never wanted to be separated from him for any length of time. Even at the age of 4, Steely would carry him around, glued to her chest, wherever she went. However, the issue of Luc's clinginess soon became a minor concern, for rumors began to reach the family that Marcel was living a lie. According to people in the scene who knew him well, Marcel was actually gay. He had a longtime male lover, a Frenchman named Francois, whom he had brought over from Martinique to work as a stylist at his new salon. These sources insisted that the real reason Marcel had left France in the first place was because his parents disapproved of his homosexuality. He had married Steely only because he and Francois had wanted to have a child together, and they knew that because of prejudice against gays in Europe and the Caribbean at the time, adoption was out of the question. Marcel had chosen my aunt to be his unwitting surrogate mother because he thought she was pretty, submissive, and gullible. Marcel was right about only one of those qualities. Like the iconic instrument she was named after, Steely could be light and airy when she sang, but underneath, she had a heart of steel. At first, Steely refused to listen to those rumors. It was only after Aliyah, being a fiercely loyal sister and having a touch of the jaguar in her fiery temperament, decided to confront Marcel, that the truth was finally revealed. Hearing one night that Marcel and Francois were alone together in the salon, Aliyah had marched over to the shop in the middle of the night and demanded they let her in. When they refused, Aliyah busted the door in with her big, broad shoulder. She found them together inside, naked. Enraged beyond reason, Aliyah pounded on Marcel. Grabbing him by his hair, she dragged him into the street and began beating him in front of a crowd of astonished onlookers. The police arrived before Marcel was seriously injured, however. The cat was out of the bag at that point, my father explained. Steely immediately filed for a divorce. The Trinidadian courts granted her wish and gave her joint custody of Luc, but Marcel could not accept it. He wanted the child all for himself, so the sneaky bastard tricked my sister into letting him take Luc to the beach. He said he would be gone for just a few hours, but they never came back. As it turned out, Marcel and Francois had gone to the airport with Luc and flown back to France. Once Steely realized that Luc had been kidnapped, she immediately flew to Paris. She petitioned the French authorities to return Luc to her, but they refused. Marcel was from a wealthy, respectable family who owned a historic estate. My aunt was a woman of color from what the French considered to be a tiny third-world country. Trinidadian laws meant nothing to them. Adding to the racist outlook, Marcel lied to the judge, insisting that he had only broken the law to save Luc from my aunt because she was a drug addict who supported herself through prostitution. Marcel had reconciled with his parents at this point, and his mother, Claudette, had developed a keen interest in keeping Luc the sole heir to the family fortune. She used her connections in the French legal system to block Steely's efforts. The judge quickly awarded Marcel full custody of Luc. He even went so far as to insult and humiliate Steely when he rendered his judgment, telling her to go back to your little island and get a respectable job, or continue doing whatever it is you do there. They all thought Steely would do just that she would realize her cause was hopeless, that she'd return to Trinidad, never to be seen or heard from again. But they had greatly misjudged my aunt. Steely stayed in France for over a year, supporting herself by taking on odd jobs, cleaning houses, babysitting, cooking, caring for elderly patients at a nursing home, or whatever work she could find. She hired a low-rent lawyer to file a motion of appeal, but it was ignored by the French courts. Finally frustrated that she'd never receive justice and be allowed to be a mother to her only child, Steely decided to act on her own. After endless begging, she managed to convince Marcel to grant her 1-hour visits with Luke once a month. These short sessions were supervised by a security guard hired by Marcel's family. However, the guard, Steely noted, apparently had a weak bladder and would often take several trips to the bathroom during his watch, leaving Steelbeth alone with Luke for several minutes. Steely realized that this was her one slim chance to escape. Looking down from my perch on the hillside, I suddenly saw a light come on in a back room in the house below me. I sat up and lifted the binoculars to my eyes. I zeroed in on the window of the room where the lights had come on. It was one of the only windows that didn't have closed blinds, so I could see inside. I saw posters for Pokemon and the Dodgers hanging on the wall. A young boy was lying on a nearby bed. He was a sweet-looking kid with olive-colored skin and big round eyes. This must be Jake, I reasoned. He appeared to be crying. His mother, Amanda Torres, was at his bedside, trying to comfort him. He must have woken up from a bad dream. Amanda was an attractive Latina woman in her early 30s. She bore a vague resemblance to J-Lo in her younger days. I watched for about 20 minutes as Amanda got her son a glass of water, then curled up on the bed beside him, comforting him until he fell asleep again. It brought back memories of my own mother, who used to do the same thing with me. After Jake finally fell asleep again, Amanda turned out the light and quietly slipped out of the room. Amanda appeared again a few moments later in the backyard of the house. I watched as she took a seat in a patio chair, lit up a smoke, and stared up at the stars. She was trying to relax herself. To be honest, I felt like a creepy fucking peeping Tom watching her like this. But what could I do? This was my job. At least I wasn't participating in Pesky's lame scheme to entrap her. Despite this, feelings of raw guilt were gnawing away at me like a rat burrowing under my skin and slowly devouring my heart. I knew that it really didn't matter that I turned Pesky down. Joe and Billy would find another stooge to do their dirty work for them. I felt so sorry for Amanda. Poor lady had no idea a team of people were working 24/7 to screw her, just as Marcel had done to my aunt. Suddenly, Amanda turned her head and looked up in my direction. For an instant, I panicked. Through the binoculars, I could see her big brown eyes staring right through me. Logically, I knew it was impossible that she could see me. Still, her penetrating gaze sent a chill down my spine. Finally, Amanda turned away and I relaxed again. She put her cigarette out in an ashtray and headed back into the house. A few moments later, the lights went out. I spent the rest of the night trying not to think about the case. There was only one good thing about this miserable fucking job. It gave me plenty of time to think about my other investigation, the one into my mother's death. I stayed on stakeout duty until around 4 a.m., but by then it was pretty clear nothing of interest would happen this evening. However, I had figured out what my next move regarding my other investigation had to be. After sleeping most of the day, I found myself at another stakeout the following evening, only this one involved surveying far more familiar quarry. I was in Escondido on a deserted hill that loomed above my grandmother's apartment complex. Billy had given me the night off from working the Amanda Torres case, so I took advantage of the opportunity to switch gears to my real investigation. Perhaps I should have taken the night off and gotten some much-needed rest, but I felt a certain amount of urgency to do some more surveillance, if for no other reason but to give myself some peace of mind. Granny had called me a few days after I found my mother's letter hidden in the puzzle box and invited me to come to dinner the following weekend at Sven's condo in Mission Bay. My grandmother said that she had wanted me to meet Sven's nephew Born and several of her new Danish friends. Admittedly, I had little rational reason to suspect anything was amiss about this. The cozy little lunch with Granny and Sven was as perfect as a Norman Rockwell picture. According to the principle of Occam's razor, I had no logical reason to be paranoid about anything. However, I was working off a very different philosophical mindset now after finding my mother's gut-wrenching letter. My new philosophy was called giving zero fucks. The only thing that mattered was finding the truth. I needed to think like a detective, not a philosopher, as Billy had explained to me the very first day I started working for him. I always assume everyone, including my client, is lying to me. It's a good way to avoid getting killed. Words to live by. I'd already caught Granny in one major falsehood. What else was she hiding from me? From my vantage point, I had an excellent view of the entrance to her second-floor unit. She only had one window that faced me, and the shades were drawn over it, so I couldn't see inside. A light came on. She was home. Now it was just a waiting game to see who came and went, and more importantly, if something interesting happened. Most likely, nothing would. Stakeouts are incredibly boring and usually come up empty. To pass the time, I lit up a joint and listened to music. I had a mix queued up of popular songs I'd heard when I went to Carnival in Trinidad a few years ago with my cousin Ronnie. The trip had changed my life. I'd taken it shortly after my mother's death, hoping to clear my head from all the pain and misery I was going through. It didn't succeed in doing that, but it did give me something else of priceless value, a connection to a culture and an extended family I'd never known. Carnival in Trinidad is one of the world's best-kept secrets. The entire island goes into a wild frenzy of non-stop partying, dancing, and jubilation that carries on night and day for a solid week. The night I arrived to play Mass, as participating in the carnival is known, my cousin Ronnie took me immediately to the huge park in the center of Port of Spain known as the Savannah. The steel drum band competition was being held that evening. Full orchestras of steel drum musicians all played their instruments in perfect unison and complex harmony. I stood in the middle of the performance area, my mouth agape, as all around me the band Exodus played a deafening symphony of classical compositions, the latest pop songs, and iconic calypso tunes. The sound was so vibrant, loud, and intense that it literally rattled my bones and shook my soul to its core. A few days later, I marched with a massive band called Young Hearts, dressed up as a pirate, wearing a colorful, loose-fitting outfit. Ronnie and I drank endless Caribbean beers while we stomped our feet and danced 1,000 strong behind huge flatbed trucks stacked with speakers and live bands, lost in jubilation as the Young Hearts wound its merry, delirious way through the twisting streets of Port of Spain like a joyous, drunken serpent. After the hangover of Carnival finally ebbed away, Ronnie's father, Silas, took me on an extended cultural tour all over Trinidad, proudly showing off all the areas of natural beauty and interest. He told me stories of Trini history and folklore. He even took me to see his friends' homes so I could see private collections of artwork by renowned Trinidadian artists like Cavallo and Bosco Holder. I got to meet all my relatives that lived on the island, including my Uncle Gregory, a brilliant man known as the Sage of Port of Spain for his prescient insight into Trini politics. I saw the old rambling family house that my father grew up in. In short, the trip to Trinidad was one of the most amazing experiences in my life. For the first time, I didn't feel out of place or like an outsider. All my Trini relatives were mixed race, just like me, and most importantly, they treated me with love and respect. But I remember the bullet holes too. There were several embedded in the sarsaparilla tree that stood in the front yard of the old family home on Flement Street. Those are from the shootout when they came for Luke, Auntie Annie told me grimly. As I mentioned before, several years prior to this, when Luke was still a child of 6, my Aunt Steelbeth had worked out a well-thought-out escape plan to get him out of France, but it would require almost perfect timing and luck. Although Marcel and his family had written her off as a fille stupide d'île, dumb girl from the islands, Steely was no fool. She'd come well prepared that fateful day with travel documents for both her and Luke hidden in her purse. She'd cashed in all her savings to purchase 2 one-way plane tickets. It was a huge gamble, and if anything went wrong, there'd be no turning back. Steely spent almost the whole 1-hour visit with Luke, smiling and trying to act as casual as she could under the circumstances. The whole time, she told me, Marcel's guard studied her closely, as if he had picked up on some small tell in her behavior that tipped him off that something was up. Steely began to worry, especially when the guard didn't take his usual bathroom break. She continued to play with Luke in the park, smiling and pretending that she wasn't dying inside. Finally, as Steely was pushing Luke on the swings, the guard came over to her. "Your time is up, madam," he said. "It's time to go." Steelbeth's heart sank. The plan would fail. All was lost. She couldn't hide the disappointment on her face. However, the guard stared at her a moment, seeing her distress, which he misinterpreted as a reaction to the playdate ending. "Tell you what, I need to take a piss. I'll give you 5 more minutes with him." "Thank you, monsieur," Steely said casually, hiding her excitement and fear. As soon as the guard went to use the public restroom, Steely took young Luke by the hand, walked to the edge of the park and hailed a cab. She had the driver take her to the train station, where she caught an express train to Madrid. From there, she and Luke boarded a direct plane flight to Caracas, Venezuela. This move was crucial to Steely's escape, for as soon as the guard exited the restroom and realized that he'd been duped, he immediately alerted Marcel, who in turn contacted the French authorities. The police contacted the airports in France, England, and Spain and had them check the manifest for any flights bound for Trinidad, but no one thought to check to see if Steely would fly indirectly home by going through Venezuela before taking a ferry over to Trinidad. La fille stupide d'Aïles has outsmarted them all. After 36 harrowing hours of non-stop travel, Steely and Luke finally arrived, safe and sound, back home, or so they thought. 6 relatively tranquil months passed without incident, although Marcel and his family made demands through the French embassy that Luke be returned to France. The Trinidadian courts denied their request, pointing out that Marcel had violated several laws by kidnapping Luke to begin with. He was invited by the Trinidadian authorities to handle the matter legally by filing a proper claim in family court if he wished to dispute custody. Ominously, there was no response from Marcel on this. According to my Aunt Steely, Luke was confused about what was happening at first, but soon settled in. He was happy to be with his mother again. "He still clung to me like a crab," Steely told me, her voice filled with emotion. "My sister thought she was okay at this point," my father explained. "She expected Marcel would bring a case against her, but she wasn't particularly worried about it since she knew the Trinidadian courts would treat her fairly. Unfortunately, my sister let her guard down. She should have known what kind of ruthless son of a bitch she's dealing with." It was around 11 p.m. on a hot, humid July evening when everyone heard a loud pounding on the door of the Flemont Street house. Steelbeth had gone to bed with Luke. My Aunt Simone and Trini grandmother Concy were awake watching an old movie on TV. Before Simone had even time to answer the door, 6 men dressed in all-black commando outfits and carrying MAC-10 submachine guns rushed into the room. Marcel strode in behind them. He'd come for Luke. The mercenaries he hired immediately pounced upon Simone and Concy, throwing my 80-year-old grandmother roughly to the floor. My Aunt Aliyah was in a back room, preparing to go to sleep. Alerted by the commotion, she peeked out her bedroom and saw Marcel and his goons. Thinking quickly, Aliyah locked her door and jumped out a window. She ran as fast as she could to summon the police. Meanwhile, Marcel and his men dragged Steelbeth and Luke into the living room. She and Luke were clinging to each other in absolute terror. Marcel ordered my aunt to let go of Luke, but Steely wouldn't comply, so Marcel and his men started beating her. Even as she was being punched, kicked, and pistol-whipped, Steely clutched onto Luke with all her might. Only after they had pummeled poor Steely until she was nearly unconscious was Marcel finally able to pry the screaming Luke from her arms. According to my father, Marcel then struck the barrel of his gun between Steelbeth's eyes and told her if it wasn't for the fact that Luke was watching, he'd kill her right then and there. Suddenly the sounds of sirens rang out. The Trinidadian police had arrived. Marcel and his mercenaries ran out of the house just as 2 police cars swerved into position outside the house, creating a roadblock. Marcel and his henchmen opened fire with their submachine guns. Bullets ripped into the police cars, but somehow missed the officers, who had taken cover behind their vehicles. They returned fire, killing one of Marcel's mercenaries in the front yard of the house. Marcel and the rest of his goons sped around to the backside of the house, hopped over a fence, and were able to make it down to the harbor. There, they jumped into inflatable boats they'd stashed in the bushes and scrambled back aboard 2 speedboats Marcel had anchored in the port. By the time the Trini police found the inflatable boats floating in the bay, Marcel and his henchmen were long gone. The Trinidadian authorities suspected they'd fled to Martinique. They immediately contacted the French embassy there and in Port of Spain and demanded they turn Marcel over and return Luke to his mother. But the French officials demurred, claiming they knew nothing of Marcel's whereabouts. The story quickly became front-page news in Trinidad and Tobago and evolved into a major diplomatic row between the 2 nations. In spite of their weak denials, it was obvious the French authorities were lying. They knew exactly where Marcel was the whole time. While they stalled the Trinidadian police, they allowed him to board a plane back to Paris with Luke. It would be 20 years before Steelbeth would see Luke again. Steely spent weeks in intensive care, recovering from the injuries she suffered during the kidnapping. According to my father, his mother Concy was never the same after the attack. She suffered from symptoms consistent with PTSD and fell into a deep depression. She died of a heart attack less than a year later. As for Marcel, he did not have long to enjoy his stolen fatherhood. Tragically, like so many gay men of his era, Both he and his lover Francois contracted AIDS a few years after the kidnapping and died. It would be wrong of me to wish death upon anyone, so I find no joy in his demise, but I feel no pity for him either. After Marcel's passing, Luc was raised by his widowed grandmother Claudette in their chateau south of Paris. For her part, Steely spent the next 20 years traveling back and forth to France from Trinidad, desperately trying to get the French authorities to allow her to see Luc again, but she was rebuffed at every turn. Claudette did everything in her power to prevent Steelbeth from having any contact with her son. According to my father, the bitter old woman continued to use her enormous wealth to block Steely in the courts. She relentlessly filled Luc's head with lies, telling him that my aunt was a prostitute and a heroin addict who only wanted to make contact with him to steal his vast inheritance. Luc apparently believed her for many years and refused to see or speak to his mother. Then, quite unexpectedly, something changed in Luc's attitude this year. I have no idea what triggered it. Perhaps it was due to conflicts he was having with his aging grandmother, or, like me, he developed an intense desire to know his ethnic roots as he got older. Whatever the reason, Luc finally agreed to meet his mother in secret. He traveled to Paris and had coffee with Steely in a cafe. Although Luc remembered a few details of the violent kidnapping, perhaps his mind was blacking things out to protect him from the trauma of it all. He did recall being in Trinidad when he was little, and how much he'd clung to his mother. After that first coffee together, the two began to speak on a regular basis and gradually began to repair their fractured relationship. It was 2 a.m. when I finally got tired of listening to my music and decided to call it a night. Nothing interesting had happened. My grandmother had stayed up until 10, then turned out the lights. I had not planned on returning the next evening because I was supposed to continue my other surveillance gig at Amanda Torres's home. Late the following afternoon, however, Billy Rose called me up and told me to take the night off. "Get some rest. Joe and I are going to pursue another angle with Miss Torres," Billy said. He didn't go into any further details, but at least they weren't asking me to get involved in their shady shit. Since I had no official duties, I drove back down to Escondido. I'd gotten a late start, so by the time I arrived at my grandmother's apartment complex, it was already past 9. I avoided the street that serviced the main gate to the complex and instead took a circuitous side route that led up the adjacent hillside. I took up my usual position behind some bushes. Zeroing in on Granny's unit, I trained my binoculars onto the window that faced my direction. The blinds were closed again, but this time the lights were off inside. The apartment was dark. Maybe she went over to Sven's or went to bed early or something, I speculated to myself. If Granny was with Sven, I reasoned that I could observe how she and Sven interacted when they didn't know I was watching. I got out my headphones so I could listen to my best of Carnival musical mix again, but as I was putting them on, something caught the corner of my eye. It was a beat-up-looking old black car that was parked across the street from the main entrance to the apartment complex. The vehicle was sitting on the side of the road, partially hidden from view by a row of thick bushes. However, from my vantage point, I could see it perfectly. "That's a strange place to park," I observed quietly to myself. Intrigued, I focused in on the car with my binoculars. The vehicle was an 80s-era Chevy Impala. One of the back windows was busted out and given a makeshift repair job with duct tape. The driver's side window was rolled down. Someone was sitting behind the wheel. They were wearing a short-sleeved shirt and their arm was hanging out the open window, resting on the door. I couldn't see their face, but from the build of their muscular arm, I knew it was a man. What the hell are they doing, I wondered. They were just sitting there, chilling, like me. Suddenly, the car door swung open and the occupants stepped out. They had their back to me, but I could make out the silhouette of a tall, lanky man. The frame of the figure looked eerily familiar, but I held my breath, not wanting to jump to conclusions. I watched as the man tossed his cigarette butt on the ground and crushed it underfoot. He then walked over to the bushes and began taking a leak. After a few moments, he zipped up his pants and turned back around to return to the car. As he strode back to the Impala, I finally saw his face in the pale moonlight. It was hard to see his features clearly in the dark, but it didn't matter because even half lit, I'd recognize that face anywhere. The revelation hit me like a punch to the gut. It was Chip.